My presentation, my talk is dedicated to the problem of, maybe it was better to name justice, but the slogan of the conference is defining the future, rethinking the past, and maybe it is better to rethink justice as injustice, which took place in present times. First of all, justice, it is very, very common notion, and there is a lot of problems to how to define this notion. There are two most important approaches. First of them is dedicated to systematic approach, which comes from Aristotle, and another one is associated with practical, moral, particular aspects of justice. In this complexity, even Hayek tells that there is a mirage of justice. In my mind, it is maybe better to say about horizon of justice. It is, and we could and we should to correlate between different aspects of justice. It is a process. So I would like, on the one hand, to clarify the content of the concept of gender justice and environmental justice. On the other hand, they are interconnected. For this, I needed to explore the relevance of the methodological foundation of the study of gender and environmental justice. And it is necessary to outline the prospects for the impact of sustainable gender equality in addressing environmental issues. To reach these goals, combining the methodology of communicative philosophy, as for me it is appropriate, with phenomenological and existentialist methodological approach based on the fact that the subjects of ecological communication are not only subjects of speech, but also subjects of consciousness, conscious existence, existential subjects who are not devoid the gender differences in contrast to Kant's Kantian transcendental subject. Hence, the need for the racial and ideal environmental communication and real environmental communication, which reveals a methodological gap between proper and existing situation, between horizon and reality. The contemporary ecological situation is primarily a consequence of the consumer productive activity. There are no doubts as for this, but it is in this context that it makes sense to turn to the gender analysis, which rejects homogenization, origin, and as a research methodology. Therefore, it is more correct to say that there is the result, that is, this is result of the consumerism of the modern male-oriented Western civilization. Attempts to breach this gap are present in Apple's dual regulatory principle of the ethics of responsibility, in which the categorical imperative of act as if you are a member of an ideal communicative community is complemented by the ontological imperative of the necessity of human survival. Today we have this evidence. This ideal ecological communication is, on the one hand, counterfactual, and therefore its main definition is the symmetrical relation of individuals in language communication, and it acts as a regulatory principle, and on the other hand, it relies only in real communication, which to ensure the coincidence of the horizon of female and male attitudes to nature should bring women's understanding of environmental issues from the realm of silence. Okay, we need to exclude this aspect. In order to consider moral issues impartially, we must turn to the concept of initial state of tone roles, which implies that discourse participants are capable of rational decision making, and moreover, they are equal partners in the contract according to ecology, surrounding nature, regardless of their actual social status. Here we can follow the example of Susan Moller-Okin, who sharply criticized the patriarchal interpretation of this concept by Rawls himself, but at the same time, she recognized its fundamental methodological significance. Okay. It was the first aspect, the correlation between ideal communicative situation and real. Second, the concept of ideal adoption of the roles of George Herbert Mead, which requires that the subject of moral judgment be concerned about the situation of all those who could be affected by the commission of problematic acts or approval of questionable norms. Thus, the imaginary nature of the initial state acts as artificial structure. At the same time, practical discourse can be defined as a process of understanding which in its form motivates all participants at the same time to the ideal acceptance of roles. Discourse can serve as a method of analysis that takes into account contextual values. It is between systematic and moral approach, diversity approach, and so on. It means a broader than usual understanding of language, which takes into account not only the designation of the final objects, for example, nature and woman, but also the expectation to see the objects as such and not another. The intention to interact with the objects presented precisely in the systematic context of language. Okay, next idea. Ideal language communication, to be correct, it should follow some demands, conditions. There are 4 conditions. Equal chance for use of communicative language acts by participants in the discourse. Equality of chances of systematization of opinions in discourse. Freedom of self-expression, which presents the formation of suppressed complexity, equality of chances for application of regulatory language, etc. But in reality, the situation is such that, as Lucer Garay emphasized, he who governs the discourse, he governs the definition of what is truth. And of course, men dominate in this process. The issue is not that women are not active enough in articulating, for example, their environmental requirements, and not that they not know about women's participation in solving environmental problems, but that the need for this is fundamentally overlooked because of the most common cultural settings. Therefore, it is not enough to motivate to deny this state of affairs when the discussion of number of the most important issues for the modern world remains fundamentally closed for women. The question is whether there is a real cultural space in which women's claims to significance in discussion environmental issues could be articulated and heard. Unfortunately, the discourse in the context described by Lacan is still quite influential. A woman doesn't exist. It doesn't exist not physically, but as a cultural agent. Instead of woman's position, there is a masculine projection, which does not always have to be accused of open hostility to nature and misogyny, but even a friendly attitude is not equal to the voice of the woman herself. So it is important to change the type of vision, contextual understanding of the situation, and in general, a change of discourse. The ability to to be participant of ecological discourse, it is capacity to say no. It is spontaneous understanding of autonomous individual of themselves and the natural world should become a linguistic reality and testify to the moral and intellectual maturity of subject. The ability of participants of ecological discourse to say no, the spontaneous understanding of individuals of themselves and natural world should become a linguistic reality and testify the moral to be a moral subject. Proponents of Wittgensteinian ecofeminism, Lee Lapsher and Donna Haraway and others draw attention to this feature of ecological discourse. However, they note that in real environmental communication, it is difficult to avoid repressive discursiveness. As soon as a woman becomes a subject of discourse, it happens that the supposed autonomy as a necessary condition for mutual criticism loses its force due to the existing traditions of stereotypes in society. The historical paradox is that, as Lapsher points out, it was a time when women achieved political rights and really assessed themselves in the political structures of society, that the problem of the autonomous subject became obsolete in philosophy. Philosophers, mostly men, for example, Derrida and others, questioned the concept of subject in principle. Without agreed environmental information, nothing will be achieved. No legitimation of environmental discourse, no mobilization of strategies, action on environment, no new patterns of rationality and behavioral patterns in public sphere as whole. This statement is based on the assumption of relationship between environmental conditions and ideas around them. The moralization of environmental problems through the structures of ethics and identity becomes a strategic element of ecological discourse as knowledge of environmental, and it becomes deeper and broader today. Today, the challenge is to expand the content of identification from personal to ontological and environmental in the context of gender aspect of ethics of justice and ethics of care. Consideration should be given to how each of both of them should be rethought in the process of environmental identification. Some researchers argue that concern is broader area in which there should be room for justice, utility, and dignity. The American philosopher Virginia Held believes that care is basic moral value. Without actual practice of care, human life cannot exist at all, because it is necessary for people to survive, although life can be without justice, but cannot be a life without care, which is a value. The opposite view is related to the belief that liberalism and egalitarianism create sufficient conditions for the realization of concern, care in the ethics of justice. However, based on the discussion between Kohlberg and Gilligan, it is possible to substantiate the assumption that the result of expanded identification is development of morality as an integration of justice and care. According to Kohlberg, the basic reference of morality is judgment rather than type of behavior, emotion, or social institution. He argues that the consideration of morality is conditioned by general formal criteria. Morality, in his understanding, refers primarily to the formal nature of the moral capacity of judgment, rather than their content. Holberg's distinguished stages of convention of moral consciousness, you know them, I will not repeat, and this is a way of deepening of consciousness, conscious racial attitude to nature and to other aspects of life. The concept of moral dilemmas as the only just dilemmas depicts moral judgments as a rational calculation, diversited from the peculiarities of its content. However, real-life dilemmas also includes love, experience, forgiveness, pity, conflict, struggle, and so on. And these aspects also are relevant to contemporary ecological situation. On the contrary to Kohlberg, Gilligan argues, moral development of women reaches a higher level not in the realization of justice in itself, but in the realization that you and others are independent of each other, and that life has value in itself and can become more sustainable through caring in relationships. Gilligan calls the basis of the theory of femininity morality, moral development based on the ethics of care. But the ethics of justice and ethics of care emerged as two diametrically opposite concepts of morality and moral development. But, in my opinion, we can say that they complement each other rather than conflict with each other. First, at the highest level of abstraction, the ethics of justice as honesty asserts that there is a universal duty to humanity. This duty is usually understood in terms of the universal requirements to respect the intrinsic dignity of all individuals. And second, the ethics of care, for its part, recognizes that moral commitment is based on the specifics of the moral context. In this sense, the ethics of care seeks the foundations of morality in associative ethics. In other words, the ethics of care is based on reversibility, interdependence. Without the ability to put yourself in the place of another, it is impossible to take care of herself. As mentioned above, the ethics of justice also causes reversibility. Kohlberg and Rawls argue that it is impossible to be honest without compassion. If justice is a function of reflexive equilibrium, then it must by definition cause reciprocity. Reciprocity is very topical problem also. Ironically, Gilligan's ideas were used to legitimize discrimination. Based on her research, certain circles have tried to dissuade women from many activities. The argument of these ideologies was as follows. Since women and men are obviously different, the exclusion of women from certain fields of activity cannot be considered discrimination as a discrimination. On the contrary, it can be seen as show of respect and respect for women and for differences. Kohlberg's and Gilligan's orientation to justice and care have many common features that also apply to nice ecosophia. All three orientations are ontological. Morality is understood here not as an abstract set of rules, but as a state of being. Morality here is not a set of principles, but a way of being in the world that includes attitudes towards other people as much as attitudes towards nature. Nice notions of ecosophy and self-realization suggest that we can be friendly to nature and the earth by expanding our awareness of ourselves through the recognition of ecological interdependence. Here, our identification is ecological, and in turn, our moral sensitivity expands to include the natural environment. And then, writes Gilligan, if we will, we can conclude in the context of Gilligan's speech, women's awareness of their rights restrains the self-destructive potential of sacrificial morality, and men's awareness of their responsibility to loved ones corrects the potential for indifference to the morality of justice and draws attention from the logic of moral choice to its real consequences. This perspective represents moral development as one that progresses in the face of states of identification that expand, generating justice in terms of increasing respect for nature and respect for women. The gender approach insists that the destruction and exploitation of nature is rooted in the dominance of men over women. It is symptomatic that the attitude, for example, towards ecofeminism changes from criticism through silence to interest and recognition as a methodological approach to contemporary ecological situation. Critical thinking is, in principle, very relevant today. Naturally, criticism of modern economics is not limited to gender methodology. For example, environmental ethics holds technology and industry responsible for the environmental crisis. But this doesn't deny the need for a gender discourse about this essence of technology and industry. In my opinion, these two approaches complement each other. For example, these ideas are borrowed by contemporary ecofeministic economists. For example, the economic model drawn by British economist Kate Rewos today is popular in her concept. GDP is replaced from the corner of economics she invites to this. And the symbol of the donuts in a ring of these donuts represents a social foundation consisting of sustainable development goals. They are very popular, familiar: food, health, political voice, and gender equality. The outer ring illustrates the ecological ceiling beyond which lies 9 planetary boundaries. It reminds us something like planetary boundaries. In fact, the task is now to bring humanity into what Rawls calls the Donut's safe and justice space. It is inside, it is not interested in growth of production, but this sustainable development could be recognized as essential. And to prevent a social shortfall and ecological overshoot. This is the aim she tries to reach. And the same conclusion is given by the United Nations Women, which is the United Nations organization part which is dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women. Inclusive development, shared prosperity and decent work, poverty eradication, social protest, peaceful and inclusive societies, environmental conservation, climate action and resilience building. To ensure that progress is accelerated and achieved across all these themes, the report calls reports of last year calls for catalysts for change, support women's movement and leadership, technology for gender equality, ensure no one is left behind, and match a commitment with resources. The merit and demerits of technology depend on its application, its accessibility for all people, and its effect on social relations, including gender relations. I don't believe that economic growth will automatically bring a reduction in gender inequality. Gender discourse about ecological justice improves the process of valuing environmental economics, disclosing the bias of the dualistic methodology in this field of economical theory, and it is appropriate. Thank you so much.